But one that has seemingly grown organically is Bitcoin. And Bitcoin, started as this sort of cyber geek's dream of peer-to-peer cash,
Yeah.
and actually is turning into what I believe is freedom money or resistance money. Not just an alternative, but a radically new way for human beings to behave. Because currently our incentives are to borrow, spend, consume, borrow, spend, consume in this endless cycle where we all become debt peons. We are
Yep.
all servants of the bank.
Keep 'em cold till I'm old. I don't plan to blow my load. Wallet so blue, if you know, you know. It's better than bonds, better than gold. Finna reap up what I sow. Fit money can't keep up, it gets sold. How many times you been told? DCA's the way to go. Higher highs, higher lows. Every year my network grows. Every day my network grows. Running relays, running nodes. Yeah. Dollar a day's a minimum. Stats, zap sats. Any fear I get, flipping them.
Harris, how are you today?
I'm very well, thank you, Seda.
Thank you so much for agreeing to be on my podcast, Ask a Bitcoiner 21 Questions. I saw you on On-Ramp Meet podcast episode where you described or you drew a comparison between the prayers and the node network with Bitcoin. And I thought I would love to have you on and just pick your brain to understand Islamic finance and some of the parallels and how you see Bitcoin, basically, based on your experience. And so before we get to the discussion, can you please introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, sure. My name is Irfan. I'm the chief executive of Cordoba Capital Markets, which is an investment company. And I'm a former investment banker with Deutsche Bank and Barclays Capital.
Very nice. And so Deutsche Bank, Barclays Capital, the first obvious question is, how did you go from that to Bitcoin?
Well, I was the co-founder of the Islamic finance team at Deutsche Bank in the early 2000s. And it was a pretty cutting edge team. I mean, we were really moving the needle in the industry and doing lots of funky things that hadn't been done before, creating products that hadn't been offered before. And, we were feeling pretty smug about ourselves, masters of the universe kind of thing. And then one day when I was delivering one of my usual lectures on the subject of Islamic finance to an audience in Dubai, somebody in the audience asked me in the Q&A, what do you think of Bitcoin? And this was sometime around early 2017. And I said, well, I don't know. Tell me about Bitcoin. What is it? I sort of heard about this thing, read about this thing in the newspapers, but really in my mind it was a sort of, magic internet money or something. And he explained it to me in this Q&A. He said, it's got this and this characteristic. And the more he started describing it, the more I started thinking, wow, this is a bit like gold. Now, gold is traditionally, and bimetallic currency is traditionally, the money of the Islamic empire of 700 years. So you had the Islamic gold dinar standard at the time. And the more I heard him talk about Bitcoin, the more I thought, well, hang on, there's so many characteristics of this type of money, which kind of seems a little bit, computery and invented rather than real and corporeal. And I had to get my mind around that. So I said, you're describing something very interesting to me. I can't tell you that I have an opinion on it now, but let me go away and research it and come back to you. And I did my X 100 hours or however long people need to spend on researching these subjects. And I came to the conclusion eventually that it's possibly the most Islamic form of money ever invented because it's ultimately low time preference and it aligns with many of the values that people who have low time preference, and often that's people of faith, it aligns with those values. So there are many rabbit holes we can now go down, but essentially I came to that conclusion as an investment banker. And then I started questioning everything that I was doing in the investment banking world and how fiat money works and the system that we're all in and the purpose of institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and the WEF and so on. And I really started questioning that and realizing that my attempts to try and change the banking industry or the financial services industry from within with Islamic finance were essentially doomed to failure. So as much as I tried for a couple of decades to produce what I believe to be a very ethical financial product, in the end, I believe it's it's done within the framework, within the context of a fundamentally rotten global economic and monetary system. And Bitcoin is what fixes it.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so many threads that I want to pull on. While I was researching, obviously on the internet without consulting experts or anything, I saw so many things that firstly made me question just my understanding of, I guess, finance in general, and sort of reinforced my very Western sort of training when I look at finance. So, what exactly is Islamic finance?
Well, we can talk about what it could be, or what it should
Yeah,
be, and what it
yeah,
currently is. So I'll start with what it should be. In theory, Islamic finance is about creating an ethical financial system for lubricating real trade and the real economy. So the theory is that any facility or any type of financing that a financier advances towards a venture or an asset should be done so on the basis of risk sharing or profit sharing. So if the venture does well, the financier and the company does well, or the individual. If the venture doesn't do well, they have to share in the losses. Now, of course, that's not how modern finance works. Modern finance is essentially, I give you 100, you give me 110 back. I don't really care
exactly.
what happens in between, and I'll take some collateral as well. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
So, throughout human history, this has led to debt peonage. Human beings as slaves because they were pledged as collateral to the financier. So this is, of course, means that the financial economy becomes the master of the real economy, which is not at all what it's meant to be. The theory in Islamic finance and Islamic economics, going back to its prophetic roots, is that trade is lawful, permissible, or halal, and riba, which is interest or usury or excess of money on money, is forbidden or haram.
yeah,
And so we have this situation where all of the global financial and monetary system is predicated around fractional reserve banking. And every time a bank makes a loan, it creates
yeah,
new money. So money is created out of nothing. And in addition, it charges interest on the new money that's been created. So this allows people who are rich to get richer and poor to get poorer, and the divide becomes more and more unequal. So Islamic economics abhors this, and it says you can't use money as a commodity to be traded. Money is only a medium of exchange so that it can value real goods and services. So when an Islamic financier enters into a transaction with a company or individual, the financier is supposed to do an amount of due diligence that incentivizes them to invest in, and I use the word invest rather than lend to,
yeah,
invest in good quality projects. The decision making has to be of a higher level than currently takes place in the global economic system. So today, if you're a venture capitalist, you throw your dart at 20 different projects and hopes one of them hits the bullseye, right? Whereas, wouldn't it be healthier if the banker or the financier did a large amount of due diligence on each venture and ensure that they were investing in something that was likely to be profitable based on their research, and then take a split of the profits or losses, and that way they've got skin in the game and they're aligned. That's why the Islamic maxim, I guess, is trade is halal and riba is haram. So trade is permissible and
yeah.
interest is impermissible.
So I guess where my brain is trying to understand how this works exactly is so what I've been taught is you're always looking at your return on invested capital, and so you have to do a calculation to figure out like what returns that you should expect. And, like, that's the primary due diligence, if you will, when you're looking at a project. So from the perspective of how Islamic finance should be, what are some of the things that the investor and not the lender will look for to decide whether to invest in a company or a project or something else?
Well, I'll give you the example of what my company does, Cordoba Capital Markets, CCM. We created a type of financing instrument that we call a profit participating note, PPN. So it's a bit like a bond, except
Yep.
it is participating in the risks and the profits or losses of a particular trade activity. So a company will come to us and they'll say, I'm an agribusiness and I manufacture a particular, or I harvest a particular product and process it in my factory, then I ship it to wholesale buyers around the world. And we need money for purchasing our raw materials. So rather than saying, here's whatever, $10 million, pay me a 10% interest rate, what we say is, right, let's sit with you for some months. We're going to understand from you exactly how your trade works from start to finish. The moment each penny comes in to your account, what happens next? What do your people do? How do you interact with the farmers who sell you their crop? Where are these factories? Can we visit these factories? What do they do? What technology do they employ? What are your relationship with your other stakeholders, the environment, your customers, your employees? What is the relationship with all of society? This is an important consideration, right? So it's a sort of enhanced ESG, if you like, environmental, social, and governance. And we want to look at all of these processes within your company. We want to make sure that your company works on a best practice basis, your operational processes, your financial health. And once we've done all this due diligence and we've sat with you for a number of months and we've helped you with some of those financial and operational processes as part of our consulting and advisory process, at that point, then we think we're ready to raise finance from external investors. And that's the point at which we then go to the capital markets. We have a series of documentation very similar to bond documentation. Mm-hmm. The difference being that we say, okay, investors, you're now going to come and your money is going to be used for working capital purposes. It's going to be used to purchase these specific things, these raw materials. And you will therefore have a beneficial interest in those containers of raw materials, whatever they are. And then we will track the processes that take place in this company, monitor them on an ongoing basis, make sure the performance is good, update you on a periodic basis how the performance is. And every time they sell to a wholesale customer, we will make sure the profits are split with you according to a predetermined ratio, which we'll determine at the outset based on what we think the risk of this activity is. And at the end of the duration of this financial instrument, your capital will be returned to you, having made a yield over those previous 12 months or whatever. So it's a true partnership between investors and the company. It's not an arm's length relationship where we say, here's some money. There's that famous scene in Goodfellas where, the gangster is saying, oh, your house burned down, F you, pay me. Somebody died in your family, F you, pay me. I don't care what happens next, right? We are not banksters. We're not gangsters. We're actually here to create a partnership with the companies that we finance. And that's prophetic in its nature, because the roots of Islamic economics goes back to what our prophet, peace be upon him, did as a job. He was a manager of people's capital.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, investors would come to him and say, I need to invest my money in a trade, go out and trade. So he'd take the caravans out beyond the city walls and would trade, textiles and spices and whatever, bring them back within the city. And of course, there's risks associated with that. There's banditry and there's bad weather and there's all sorts of other market and performance risks associated with doing that trade. So it's a risky activity. It's a venture. But he came to have a reputation as being very reliable, very competent, and very trustworthy. And so he was entrusted with people's capital. And that trust was important to him as a manager of capital. And when the caravans come back within the city walls and they trade their goods in the market and he turns a profit, he then shares that profit according to a pre-agreed ratio with his investors. And the basis of this investment management arrangement should be the basis of the Islamic finance industry. Unfortunately, it is not today. The contemporary Islamic finance industry is actually a sort of reverse engineering of conventional bank debt finance.
So, it's amazing because clearly this is beyond like an Excel spreadsheet exercise. The fact that you actually go and you speak to people, and that in itself helps to develop a relationship, which, that completely blows my mind. And in our email exchange, when you made the distinction between what it should be and what it is, a light bulb went off because in part of my research, I looked at I think it's called the S&P Sharia index or something,
Yep.
which is where I found the term Sharia-compliant, which I peppered throughout the interview notes and questions. And I was very surprised. I think it's like 49% of the index is, or 46 or something, American companies. And I saw like Apple and Nvidia.
Yeah.
And so I became quite confused because I mean, to me, they operate in what I consider traditional, but I'll say Western. They operate from a Western financial lens. You know, bonds are okay. And then I saw in the notes that I think it's like your revenues cannot exceed maybe 5% or
Yeah.
something like that from interest.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, well, and there are other conditions as well,
Yeah.
no pork, no gambling, et cetera, no alcohol, et cetera, et cetera. But that to me seemed kind of curious. And so what it is today and why is it like this today as opposed to what you describe?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the challenges that we have in the industry that we have focused very much on sort of negative covenants rather than positive covenants. So the industry has been shaped by Sharia scholars. These are individuals who are well versed in the jurisprudence of Islamic finance transactions and commercial transactions. And they also often are, you know, economists or lawyers in their own right. So they have a sort of joint role. And as Sharia scholars, their job is to, quote unquote, uphold the standards of Sharia. Now, to date, over the past, let's say 60 years, which is since the birth of the modern Islamic finance industry, they're very much focused on what can we not do in order to remain Sharia compliant. And so they've created a set of filters, which you've named a couple of those filters. One of them is not more than 5% of your business, of your revenues can be derived from non-compliant activities, impermissible activities, generally vice activities, you know, arms manufacturing, alcohol, tobacco, gambling, etc. And there are other filters, such as your balance sheet can't have more than 33% debt versus market cap, which is if you ask me, it's a very arbitrary number. And there are reasons why they've derived that particular 1/3 ratio. But some people might argue, well, actually, since all interest is haram or impermissible, how can you have any interest-bearing debt on the balance sheet? Surely even 1 penny of interest-bearing debt would render it non-compliant. But I think scholars have tried to be pragmatic in order to allow the development of the modern Islamic finance industry. And we are still employing these, I think, somewhat outdated financial filters, these negative filters that say you can't do this, your balance sheet must be below this particular threshold, etc. And I think it's about time that the industry moved forward and said, well, hang on, there is this whole other non-faith-based investment industry called ESG or SRI, or whatever we want to call it, United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment, or whatever we want to call it. And, you know, they talk about other stakeholders, the environment, for example, labor relations, sustainability, how we treat our employees, etc., etc. And we don't really think about these when we look at the very sort of clinical financial filters that we apply. We don't think about what does this company actually do. So I think it's the industry are ripe for change. It needs to learn from what the ESG industry has done and maybe incorporate some of those principles. So yes, it's true that when you look at the S&P 500, a lot of the companies are deemed to be Sharia compliant under these fairly arbitrary financial filters. But I mean, I wonder, I look at some companies who may be past these filters, but are engaged in, you know, what I would loosely call the military-industrial complex, and I don't know, build software that pilots killer drones, which is not particularly Sharia compliant at all, and yet it's not caught by these mathematical filters.
Yeah, it seems. I feel as though. Well, actually, my question. When, I guess, I don't know if this is the right way to say it, but Islamic finance, you know, the origin of it, when that was being developed, was trade so international, or was it focused on a specific region? Do you see what I'm saying? Like, is it the result of, I guess, capital markets being so accessible to the entire globe, basically? That makes it so that, I guess, scholars have to figure out a way how to, incorporate Islamic finance with, Western capital markets.
Yeah, there's this tension between idealism and pragmatism. So if you go back 1400 years, you're looking at the development of a financial system based on these ethical principles that eventually found its way spread all the way down the Silk Road from China to Southern Europe. So you could argue that was, global for the time.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
could say that many of the principles that were codified at the time as a result of the development of the jurisprudence of financial transactions in Sharia law found their way into Southern Europe. And if you look at some aspects of English law, for example, the trust law that we have in England is actually derived from the waqf, or the endowment, in early Islamic jurisprudence. There are many other examples of types of financial and commercial activities and contractual relationships that businesses and people may have that may find their origins in this neighboring civilization from 1400 years ago. So there is that, and I think at the time it very much represented the zenith of what was possible in the then global capital markets, global financial markets. The development of this trade route with all its various venture capital firms and trading houses and so on, and money exchanges and checks and travelers' checks, and I mean, really, it was quite extraordinary what was developed at the time. And we don't Europe today pretends not to remember that it owes a sort of moral debt, if you like, to these neighboring civilizations that developed these techniques way back when. Then we fast forward to the early 1960s, and I would say that's the starting point of the modern Islamic finance industry. And initially, there is very much an intention to return to those roots of real economy and risk sharing, where everybody is a stakeholder.
Yeah.
And there's an experiment in Egypt by a famous economist who set up essentially a social savings institution. And this institution takes in deposits from depositors, and it invests those deposits into local industry. And then it shares the returns from local industry with the depositors. So that's a very Shariah-compliant investment management relationship, very prophetic in its practice. Then you go forward a few more years, and now you have the development of the sort of wholesale and multilateral banks, which are Sharia-compliant. Except now they have to operate within a global system, which is run by central banks, and which require you to have a license to act as a bank. And if you act as a bank, then you must create money. Every time you take in your deposits as reserves, you're allowed to lend more than you hold in deposits, and hence fractional reserve banking. So you've now created new money, which inherently is not Sharia compliant, right? That doesn't make any sense. But we've overlaid these so-called halal contracts on top of these fractional reserve institutions, and we've called it Islamic banking. So that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, really.
Hi, everyone. It's Saida, host of Ask a Bitcoiner 21 Questions. To my listeners based in Canada and the US, if you're looking for a seamless way to stack sats, i.e., save money in Bitcoin, check out the Bitcoin Well. And you're probably thinking, Sai, you moved to Switzerland a long time ago. How do you know the service is good? Well, I asked my father, the man who famously told me there's nothing wrong with being frugal, to test out their service, and everything checks out. He visited one of the ATMs in Scarborough. It was very intuitive, very easy to use, and the fees were not too high. So if my dad says it's okay, it's okay. Remember to use referral code AAB21Q when you stack sats with the Bitcoin Well, and please, 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 let me know how your experience is. Give me all of the details. And if you'd ever like to be on Ask a Bitcoiner 21 Questions to talk about your experience with Bitcoin Well, or just your experience with Bitcoin in general, I would be more than happy to host you. You know, as you say that, 2 or 3 years ago, I was listening to an interview with Caitlin Long. because she's had issues with her bank in the US. And she mentioned that in the US, there is or was a bank that refused fractional reserve lending. So they held 100% of deposits. And I think maybe they lost their banking license or something, but they encountered a lot of issues because they refused to, I guess, play the banking game.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I'm not hugely familiar with the politics around that, but I can certainly understand if you introduce an alternative financing or banking system that doesn't rely on money creation and the supremacy of fiat money, then there are going to be a lot of people who are going to be pretty annoyed and irritated by this, and they will do what they can to prevent it from becoming a thing. And hence why those who advocate for non-fiat forms of money, which we're going to come on to,
Yeah, perfect segue.
are constantly battling this battle against the so-called establishment.
So I'd like to have your take on two things. How Bitcoin fits into what Islamic finance should be, and also the environment in the UK with respect to Bitcoin.
Yeah, so I mean, if we look at Islamic finance today, it's very much a reverse engineering of conventional banks. Though, they take this fractional reserve model and they create loan contracts on top of it, which look very nice because they are at least superficially based on traditional contractual structures in Islamic finance, but actually underpinning this all is a banking environment. So how is it possible for us to move away from that? I thought it was possible once when I was at Deutsche Bank and then Barclays. I thought it's possible to create these ethical financial products within a conventional international investment bank and to offer these to Muslims as fully Sharia-compliant products. And I now realize that's not possible because the system itself relies on money creation. But what if there was a form of money that couldn't be created from nothing? And the problem that we have today is that the sole global reserve currency, which is the US dollar, is so dominant in international trade and the banking system that it's very hard to create an alternative. But one that has seemingly grown organically is Bitcoin. And Bitcoin, started as this sort of cyber geek's dream of peer-to-peer cash.
Yeah.
And actually is turning into what I believe is freedom money or resistance money. And it is money that is not just an alternative, but a radically new way for human beings to behave. Because currently our incentives are to borrow, spend, consume in this endless cycle where we all become debt peons. We are all servants of the bank. And from the moment we go to university, we take on student loans. Actually, well before that, our families are already loaded with debt through mortgages and car financing and so on. And we are encouraged to turn over our material goods, our mobile phone contracts are on 2-year renewals.
Yep.
Our furniture, everything that we possess, we buy things on credit. We look at the monthly cost of these things rather than the asset value of these things. We don't save and invest for the future. We borrow, spend, and consume for today. And so our mindset has become high time preference. And that is all encouraged because money devalues very fast, because money is printed very fast. And if it devalues fast, you don't want to keep it. You want to spend it or you want to throw it at meaningless, poor quality ventures, which is why venture capitalists throw 20 darts at a dartboard and hope one of them sticks. So here we have we have a type of money that is so philosophically different to what we've had for the past 100 years and actually takes us back to the majority of human history when we had gold or bimetallic currency as a monetary standard. So in some senses, Bitcoin is reverting to the mean rather than something radically different. The radically different bit was the last 100 years of Keynesianism and the US dollar. And we're already seeing, I think, the beginning of the end of the dominance of the US dollar. As we speak, it's already, 135 to the pound and still on its way down. So I am hopeful that Bitcoin as a form of resistance money or freedom money, which can't be created from nothing, which
Yeah.
requires proof of work, which can't be printed from nothing, which can't be lent and created in the process of lending as fiat money is.
Yeah.
This is all very healthy for an economy.
Yeah, definitely. Um, when you take a step back, when you position things to say, like, perhaps the past 100 years is an exception, I see that. I can understand that because before, I guess the rise of the US dollar, people operated differently. And from my understanding too, in certain regions, there were multiple currencies at play. And so, and they were all tethered to gold or to something that was more sound. So I hear that. So what are your thoughts though on Tether as a means of sort of keeping US currency alive?
So I'm not normally an advocate for other forms of crypto and digital assets other than Bitcoin, but I do see some value in Tether, and the reason why I see that is for a specific use case. I wanted to donate something to get medicines and food on the ground in Gaza.
Yeah.
None of the banking rails worked because every time a new bank account was set up, it got blocked. And the only way to get money in to save people on the ground was either through Bitcoin or through Tether, which could be exchanged on the ground in Palestine. And so I see value in that. If it's useful
Yeah.
as a form of freedom money, then certainly. But I mean, in the long term, of course, anything that's linked to a fiat money for me,
Yeah.
stable coins are just another form of fiat, really. So I'm not in the long term. I'm not an advocate of that.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not a crypto person by any stretch of the imagination, and it's. I think it was when I had. Oh my goodness, I'm drawing a blank, but I was speaking to someone who said that, his only option was to be paid in Tether. And I thought, okay, I withheld my judgment and my, crypto bad sort of mindset. And I understood that if you're in a situation where you need it to eat, I can understand its use case.
Yeah, it has its uses, absolutely.
And so Bitcoin adoption in the UK. So from the headlines that I read, it would seem as though it's not permitted, or perhaps it is, because maybe I think Gemini is an exchange that's very popular there, perhaps, or Revolut. And so it seems as though some people in the UK have access to it, but it's not something that's easy to custody like it is here in Switzerland, for example, where, I can walk into the post office and buy like a Bitcoin card, and
That's pretty good. We can't do that here. I'm very pleased to hear that. I mean, the UK is, I would say, a little behind the curve on digital assets generally. They do make a lot of noise at government levels and say, we're open to business and we're all about growth. But the reality is, I think the UK is somewhat stagnant in this sense. And yes, we can access Bitcoin. Yes, we've got exchanges we can use. We can self-custody. There's no reason not to. It's not banned in any way. It's not illegal in any way. In fact, actually, HMRC itself, which is the tax authority here, they accommodate for digital assets and cryptocurrency.
Oh, okay.
They say that, look, if you hold it, then you have to pay tax on it from your gains, which in a sense is, I mean, if you are somebody that believes paying taxes is a good thing, which is not everybody, then in a sense that's encouraging, because it means that if the tax authority is willing to accommodate digital assets and Bitcoin specifically, then that means it can't be illegal, right? That means you can use it if you need to. So I
exactly.
think that's
Is that
encouraging.
a wealth tax or a tax on unrealized gains that you have to pay?
It's on capital gains. I don't believe it's on unrealized gains at this
Oh,
point
okay.
in time, but you never know what's on the table with HMRC. They are literally a law unto themselves, very much like the IRS in the US. So who knows what they will say next.
Yeah. So adoption is, and within the Muslim community in the UK, is there, are there discussions in mosques or in other gatherings about Bitcoin or about other avenues, or is it still very much about, I guess, the British pound?
So this is starting to happen in the Muslim community in the UK. They're starting to wake up to the idea that Bitcoin not only is halal or religiously permissible, but also potentially could be as good as gold, if not better, at least in the modern context. And whereas, say, when I first started my journey with Bitcoin in 2017, the prevailing attitude from Sharia scholars was Bitcoin is haram because, and all the usual FUD, money laundering and terrorist financing and, environment, this and that, and all of these things that we know are easily rebutted. We know that these are false arguments that are made to sound plausible, and it's easy for us to correct whoever is using those arguments. But the scholars, had only read what they'd read in the newspapers and assumed, whatever the journalist was telling them was correct. So over time, scholars have become a lot more savvy. They've done their research, and many of the particularly younger, more tech-savvy ones have started to understand that this is an incredible type of technology that is a new type of money, and in some senses is better than gold, which is the traditional money of Islam, and therefore can move us towards a more healthy economy, a more healthy relationship between us in society. And so that conversation is now a much more healthy and nuanced one, where people up and down the country in mosques can say, I think Bitcoin is not only not haram or impermissible, but actually maybe something very good for us. So we should start to adopt it as a community. Practically speaking, it hasn't really taken hold. We're not using it on a daily basis. We're not buying our coffees and pizzas with it. But, actually the conversation is starting to take place, and that's a very healthy thing.
So I guess from a more, if you're a scholar, so I'm guessing scholars sort of I don't want to use the word dictate, but they kind of set the pace on what is halal, what is haram, And so if you are a Bitcoiner and your scholar is saying, this is haram, how do you gently push back or say, perhaps you should read this? Or do you not touch the thing if you're very faithful? Do you not touch it because your scholar says that it's haram? How is that managed?
Yeah. As in all things in life, we look to leaders who are credible and qualified. And I think one of the challenges that we've had in the Muslim community all over the world, not just the UK, is that when a scholar, and we can put that in inverted commas, says that something is good or bad, what are the credentials of that scholar to come to that conclusion? Yep. And I think in the early days, many of the scholars simply didn't have the credentials. Many of them are sort of social media scholars, posting whatever they posted on X or TikTok or whatever.
Oh, really?
And, they come across some new phenomenon or some new fad, and they post their view on it based on whatever they happen to know at the time. And they did the same thing with Bitcoin without really understanding it properly. And then you've got some much more credible and qualified scholars who, for example, may be experts in a particular branch of jurisprudence called fiqh al-mu'amalat, which means the jurisprudence of commercial and financial transactions. Wow. These are scholars who are extremely well versed in the modern economic and banking and monetary system. They typically sit on the Sharia boards of Islamic banks, for example, and they opine on the compliance or otherwise of particular financial products. So these are very highly trained experts. And those individuals, not the social media scholars, are the ones that the community should be looking to and saying, right, this guy's background is in this, this, and this. They've done these sort of transactions before. They're credible. They understand Islamic economics and they understand modern finance. So on that basis, I should probably pay more attention to them than the social media guy on TikTok. So, this is something that we're starting to realize as a community, and we're starting to see the emergence of these younger tech-savvy scholars who are really well-versed in this subject. And that's starting to make a difference to the community now.
Yeah. And so can non-Muslims participate in Islamic finance, or is this really, what's the boundary, I guess, is the bigger question to it?
So the simple answer is absolutely yes. Islamic finance is not for Muslims. It's for humanity.
Yeah.
So this idea that it's we have this perennial debate in the UK, particularly in the right-wing red top tabloid newspapers, where some mention will be made of some new law that's been passed by Parliament, for example, to erase the double stamp duty on property purchases under an Islamic finance home mortgage. Now, the reason why the British government introduced a particular rule for alternative financial product providers to remove a double stamp duty was
Sorry, what's a
because
stamp?
so stamp duty is when you buy a house in the UK, you are required to pay the government a
Oh,
tax.
sorry. Siri is listening. Wow. Did you hear that?
I just about heard it, yeah. I'll go back to
Continue.
the start
Sorry.
of that one. Yeah.
Yeah. What's a stamp?
So in the UK, you have a stamp duty, which is a tax payable to the British government on a house purchase and sometimes other asset purchases as well. So anyone who buys a house has to pay quite a large amount of tax to the British government when they buy that house. Now, when you have a home finance provider, a standard high street bank that provides a mortgage, you pay that stamp duty once to the government. Unfortunately, if you have an Islamic bank, because in theory, the Islamic bank is required to take legal title to that house, and therefore they are the purchaser of that house, and then you as the borrower are the tenant effectively. It's only when the capital is repaid that you take legal title to your house. So you
Oh, I
effectively
see.
pay stamp duty twice,
Yeah.
which of course is unfair. So the British government introduced legislation to erase the second stamp duty,
Yeah, I
which would have
see.
made it not a level playing field. But of course, you speak to the right-wing tabloids and they froth at the mouth over this, like, oh, we're giving special treatment. Well, no, we're not giving special treatment. We're just equalizing the treatment. That's what we're doing.
Yeah.
So that's what we have to be careful of in the UK, that Islamic finance is intended for everybody. In fact, two of the Islamic banks in the UK offer such an attractive rate on their term deposits that a very large proportion of their customers are non-Muslim. In Malaysia, I think almost 50% of all Islamic bank customers are from the Chinese community, the non-Muslim Chinese community. So, of course, it's not intended for, I mean, yes, it caters to Muslims it reaches the standards required by their faith, but it is intended for everybody. And actually,
Yeah.
I believe that Islamic finance, if done right, in the way that I previously described as real economy and risk sharing,
Yeah.
is something that I personally don't brand as Sharia compliant or Islamic
Yeah.
in my marketing literature. I just describe it as ethical finance that's
Yeah.
risk sharing and based on real trade. And I want everybody to come to it. The companies that I finance are not particularly designated, certified as halal necessarily, even though their business is permissible in Islam. And similarly, many of my investors are not necessarily seeking a particularly Sharia compliant type of
Yeah.
investment. They just want a high quality investment in a well structured deal with attractive rates of return. So, I think that it's a type of financing for everyone, not for a particular group of people.
Yeah. It sounds like there are deep divisions in the UK. I participate in a few Twitter spaces and I hear it. I haven't been to the UK in a few years now, so I haven't seen what things are actually like on the ground, but it does seem as though the divisions are getting even deeper between different groups there.
I think this is a worldwide phenomenon,
Yeah.
polarized sort of politics, echo chambers through social media that
Yeah.
amplify these, spreading of misinformation. We saw very recently, you'll have perhaps heard the news about a car that plowed into a group of football supporters in Liverpool who were celebrating Liverpool's
Oh.
recent title. And, the Merseyside police were very quick to point out that this was a white British male. Because the last time there was an incident of a similar nature, a year ago, there was a tragedy in the same city when three little girls were stabbed by a crazed
Oh
lunatic.
dear. Yeah.
And the misinformation network went haywire. And people started repeating false information about the attacker being a migrant, with a Muslim name and all false information. He was actually a Brit. And he was frankly a mentally deranged individual. He had
as one would have
problems.
to be to do that to little
This was not
girls.
a politically driven or terrorist attack.
Yeah.
So this polarization that's taken place has meant that, and I think it's driven by a small group of people, by the way. It's people like the owner of X, who deliberately spread this misinformation, as he did last year in that previous attack. He spread misinformation himself. And with, I don't know however hundreds of millions of followers he had, all the crazy and stupid people listen to what he has to say and they repeat it. And this cycle keeps continuing. So I think that's a problem. And I don't know what's going to fix it. But I think the first thing to do is to recognize that it's a problem and that there's misinformation out there that is polarizing our views and that is drawing society further away from each other, not putting them together.
So the famous saying in Bitcoin fixes this. Do you think that Bitcoin could help at least to fix like the social dynamic in the UK and perhaps even get people interested in Islamic finance or ethical finance, as you say, where it's really a partnership as opposed to here's money, give me more back?
I think there's two levels on which I think Bitcoin could be helpful in this regard. The first is in terms of society. I think it would nudge us towards long-term incentives, saving, investing for the future, moving away from consumerism. So I think that's one very healthy reason why I think Bitcoin could be very helpful, developing an alternative societal system, but also an alternative monetary system. So that's the second reason. I think that it would hopefully help prevent the conveyor belt between Goldman Sachs and the Treasury, between big investment banks and government, or big investment banks and multilaterals, or world organizations or central banks. I think that this is a very unhealthy rule by a very small group of people, a corporatocracy, if you like. There's a very famous book on this subject called Confessions of an Economic Hitman.
Oh yeah,
by a guy
I've
called
read
John
that.
Perkins.
Yeah.
And you may not agree with everything that's written in this book, but I can tell you, based on my time in the industry over 30 years, I see examples of those modern economic hitmen and women who are busy forming the world in a way that essentially creates servants and slaves out of one class of society and masters out of another class of society. And that is not going to change as long as we have the wrong incentives. And fiat money creates those incentives. And the banking system that arises out of fiat money amplifies those incentives. So I'm a firm believer that we need to rip it apart and start again. Unfortunately, ripping it apart is a massive upheaval and perhaps not very pragmatic. So I don't know whether it's possible to do this by baby steps, but certainly on the ground, people are starting to adopt and use Bitcoin. Maybe not on a daily basis just yet, but certainly on an infrequent basis. And I hope that becomes more frequent as we keep on adopting.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of controversy about a strategic Bitcoin reserve. It could be in El Salvador or in the US right now with Donald Trump. And I try to sort of remain neutral with the, pros and cons to simplify it a bit. But one thing that I hope is that if the US does adopt an SBR and they are vocal about it, that may incentivize, if not other countries, citizens from other countries to say, why are they doing this? And then I guess slowly but surely start to learn about Bitcoin and perhaps fall down the rabbit hole and figure out how they or how their family can develop their own strategic Bitcoin reserve. And it's probably naive, but it is seriously my hope that that can lead to just a shift in mindset to lower your time preference, to get to know individuals instead of, stereotyping everyone and just participating in sort of the social decline that seems to be happening today.
Yeah, I agree. I would say that that's a positive side effect of the US talking about a strategic Bitcoin reserve. I mean, there are some potential negatives as well. If you are a Bitcoin maximalist and you believe that Bitcoin should be, the most democratically socialized, friendly form of money, resistance money, freedom money, whatever you want to call it, then you don't want institutions to dominate it. You don't want BlackRock and the American government to be the holders of it. But there is a beneficial side effect, and that is that people see around the world how important it is. and they start accumulating and adopting it as quick as they can.
Yeah.
So that is a positive side effect. And I hope they do that faster than the US can get to 1 million Bitcoin.
Yeah, I know, really. Well, thank you so much for this interview. I will watch and rewatch this just to, pick up on. There's a huge knowledge gap with respect to Islamic finance. Can you remind people or tell people where they can find you, a website, perhaps on social media, and maybe even if they have questions, how they can contact you to follow up?
Yeah, sure. I'm on X as Haris Irfan. I'm on LinkedIn under the same name. My company is Cordoba Capital Markets. It's under www.ccmarkets.com. And that's where you can find me.
Perfect. Thank you so much for this interview.
Thank you, Saida.
Keys. Yeah. Man like quakes. Man like who? Yeah. Takes her Bitcoin off exchanges under self-custody. She runs her own node, providing liquidity. Yeah, she got her own keys. She got her own keys. She got her own keys. Yeah, she got her own keys. 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 Yeah, she got her own keys.